Hello and welcome to the Association for Art History's Art History Festival for 2024. This is the third iteration of our festival, which began in 2021, and we're very happy that you've all joined us for this first talk. My name is Greg Perry. I'm the CEO of the association, and this morning's talk is the first offering of some 90 programs that will be part of the festival this week that runs through Sunday. This year's event, with the theme of art history from local to global, will explore our subjects within community-based contexts and all the way up to global and transnational ones. And it will encompass the wide geographic, cultural, and temporal variety of art history. All events in the festival are free and they are offered around the country at our partners' venues as well as online. We're very grateful for the support of the National Gallery Trust and the Arts Council England, which has helped us to realize this complex and large project and make it available without cost to those attending. So the festival begins with today's talk, which is appropriately entitled, How Do We Write a More Global, More Inclusive History of Art? And is offered by Eric de Chassey, who is the director of the French National Institute of Art History and professor of modern and contemporary art at the École Normale Supérieure in Lyon. Eric has published extensively on the work of Matisse, on US and European art, transatlantic cultural relationships, and the visual culture of the second half of the 20th century, especially in relationship with the counterculture and politics. In addition to his academic work, Eric has curated a number of exhibitions in Europe and the US. He chairs the International Network of Research Institutes in Art History, RIHA, and the editorial board of the international project, The Visual Arts in Europe, an Open History. Before his talk begins, I want to remind those in attendance that we'll take questions via the Q&A function. I'll have a look at those and pose them to Eric after his talk ends. So we're so pleased that Eric has joined the festival and that the National Institute of Art History is represented in our event this year. So without further delay, I'll now hand it over to Eric de Chassey.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you for inviting me to speak in your Art History Festival. Of course, I'm particularly glad that we are able to work together, as we in France have also been organizing a Festival of Art History for now more than 10 years, with a lot of foreign guests every year. But without further delay, I'm gonna go into my speech for today and share my screen. No, whoop. Yeah. Let me start with an image object, which I chose not as an illustration of the topic I'm planning to address, but because it encapsulates, in a way, several issues that are crucial when considering the possibility of writing a more global, more inclusive history of art. I find it fitting to start with an object image because I think it necessary to emphasize that the main specificity of art history, what makes it different from all other fields of inquiry and constitutes its potential additional value in terms of questions and answers, is that it deals with objects' images, potentially with any object that has a visual dimension or with images that have a concrete dimension. And I find it appropriate that this object image originates from ancient Egypt because it is where the first author of an international pluricultural art history, although not very inclusive and not very global, but for its time, Johann Joachim Winckelmann, started the inquiry, which in a way is the basis of all subsequent art histories written in the Western world. And also because Egypt is a contested situation, location, relevant in terms of what is global and what is not, as this place has been variously considered Western, non-Western, barbarian, African, Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, Near Eastern, even European in a way. So what I'll do is try to see what lessons looking and considering this sculpture can teach us. And I'll start with lesson 1. This is a sculpture that I encountered by chance in Richmond at the Virginia Museum of Fine Art. This museum is an important universal museum, or so-called universal museum, modeled on European 19th century precedents, and in itself, like many museums in the Western Hemisphere, it proposes a sort of, or Northern Hemisphere, it proposes a sort of global art history in a concrete form, going from ancient to the present, albeit in a slightly anachronistic order, because the architecture makes it impossible to follow a completely logical path. The path was devised for what was considered universal in the 19th century or early 20th century, and not for today's models. I stumbled upon this sculpture amidst the ancient Egyptian room, which is located between the ancient Greek, Etruscan, and Roman, and European Renaissance rooms. Lesson 1. Global art history has been here for a long time in our universal museums, or so-called universal museums, which start since the 18th century and Winckelmann with Egyptian or Mesopotamian art, and strive to find logic in their collections while trying to include what was, not so long ago, considered marginal and hence not worthy of showing. A moral imperative of global art history is that it has to take into account the fact that some human groups were subjected to an exceptional degree of violence throughout history, that it would be adding insult to injury if the last word was left to the persecutors, as one of my friends told me. And of course, the history of Egypt has been the history of a power, a global power, or at least a regional power, but which went very far from its original territory in the ancient time, and then a power subjected to colonial violence in since the 18th century. In the Virginia Museum Virginia Museum of Art, like in many other museums, this taking into account the fact that some human groups were subjected to an exceptional degree of violence has been addressed, for instance, at the time of my visit, at least, I don't know what it is now, in the Tapestry Hall at the junction of the European and African, Native American, and pre-Columbian rooms, with the parallel hanging of 2 large portraits by British 18th century artist Joshua Reynolds and contemporary African-American artist Kehinde Wiley, as well as some tapestries, as you can see. Lesson 2. I was struck by this sculpture in a pseudo-immediate aesthetic rapture, knowing nothing or nearly nothing about its context at the time when I saw it. As I'm not a specialist of ancient Egyptian art, far from it, my knowledge in this field is perforce rather limited. I admit that at the time of my encounter with this object image, I knew nearly nothing of the 30th dynasty, the period when it was now supposed to have been made. It is the concrete encounter with this sculpture that determined my further readings, which are still cursory. I assumed that I grasped something of the sculpture's quality, if I dare use that word, which art historians are now tending to avoid when they consider their own objects. I must say, while using it without remorse when they talk about other artistic fields, such as music or cinema, as long as it is for their private pleasure. So what I did was placing this sculpture felt quality against what I knew of Egyptian sculpture, and also seeing it, or seeing in it, something that reminded me of formal qualities I have long been in love with. The curve on the face reminded me, although not consciously at the time, of Alphonse Kelly, who was indeed fascinated early on by ancient Egyptian art, as you can see by the reproduction of this painting on the left, when he was just 25 or 26. This particular object image seems to achieve its specificity through a renegotiation of an old tradition on the other side. It shows what can be called a neo-archaism, imitates and transforms models from the 26th dynasty, 200 years before, as if no evolutions in sculpture had taken place in the meantime. These models themselves dialoguing with much older precedents from the Middle Kingdom around 1700, 1600 BCE. And it carries off this renegotiation through new collective precepts, such as the deep drill holes at the corners of the mouth that you can very clearly see, even if they're also coming from these precedents. And the individual doings of an artist, even though we cannot identify him. It's most certainly in the Egyptian system of the time a him, but there's no necessity or no reason to completely rule out the possibility of a female artist. As I'm also an old reader of Pierre Bourdieu, I do know that, to quote him, my love of art is conditioned. Even if I have met numerous artists, much less privileged and conditioned than me, whose entire career was premised on one unexpected aesthetic encounter. This is the case, in fact, of two artists of Algerian origins or Algerian-born, living in France. I have extensively worked with and written on Djamel Tatta and Adel Abdessemed. Both of them have always told me and told the public in general that they knew nothing about art when they were either looking at the reproduction of art in magazine, for the case of Adel Abdessemed, or being taken to museum with replicas in the case of Djamel Tatta, and then deciding that they wanted to become artists and starting to look at everything. Therefore, I will try to say that there's a second lesson. Aesthetic pleasure counts in art history, even if it's not enough. Because if we think that such a thing as art exists, it lies precisely in the possibility of experiencing the effects of a specific configuration in the here and now, even if what causes this experience has been created in a distant context. An artwork embodies a worldview that is at least partially transmitted and does not always need to be translated in order to be efficient. Its meanings, always unstable, are the result of such encounters, and we can only try to explain how they have made us or others interested in the first place. What is crucial is the visual dimension of that encounter, which in a way accounts for the specificity of art history, if we care about adding something to history or to aesthetics. This attitude might lead us into some traps, as it clearly depends on the accumulated knowledge, prejudices, and aesthetics experiences of singular viewers, and there I join Pierre Bourdieu, as it can also yield to pseudomorphisms which I think is what happens in this precise installation, comparing Egyptian art with later Western African art and pretending that there is a direct link. But it can be corrected by getting access to scientific resources, which are now, fortunately, widely available through digital means and libraries, even if widely is still not enough. Now, lesson 3. What particularly struck me was the way the sculptor carefully chose a block of black granite with a diagonal rose-colored vein to carve this head. This is only a fragment of a larger sculpture, and we don't know how the rest of the sculpture looked like. But we know that the choice of this kind of material was frequently favored by artists of the late Egyptian period. The rose vein circles the egg-shaped head on 3 sides and creates an internal movement, a movement which is integral to its effect on any viewer, and contradicts the frontality which is usually taken as characterizing Egyptian sculpture. This effect, of course, cannot be fully grasped in a reproduction, nor are psychological interpretations of the sculpture possible without seeing it concretely in the flesh, so to speak. Depending on the way it is photographed, it appears to display a slight smile or looks very stern, for example. And the sculpture was even described as expressionless by at least one writer. So, lesson 3. Materiality counts in art history, and the feasibility of a more global art history depends heavily on the possibility for art historians to travel and be able to experience it firsthand. One of the most obvious problems of a global art history is that all art historians are not equal in this regard. Western art historians affiliated with rich institutions, such as West European and North American universities and museums, are indeed incredibly privileged compared with their colleagues from the rest of the world, for whom it is usually difficult to travel widely, both because they lack the financial means to do so and because they face travel restrictions because of visas, etc. We need to make sure that, taking into account the needs of global warming and control of climate changes, and taking into account that, we need to make sure that such opportunities are made more widely available, and hope that one day our non-Western colleagues can also travel widely, so that global art history is no longer a construct of Western art historians, but a shared global art history. Another provisional solution is to ensure a wider circulation of collections through temporary exhibitions, which should not be exclusive to rich Western countries, or through extended loans from privileged parts of the world, which could be envisioned while we are talking about restitutions. Even if I know that the Universal Museum is a Western concept, I still believe that its dissemination throughout the world could be a solution rather than a problem. If people want to do away with art and art history because they see them as essentially Eurocentric, so be it. But it can also be fruitful to use this model in order to open it both from the outside and from the inside. The Louvre Abu Dhabi offers an example, even though it is not the solution because it is located in a country which is inaccessible to most. But it is a step, I think, in the right direction, especially if its collection and organization are truly co-constructed and not devised by French art historians only, as has been somehow the case, even if it's changing. Lesson 4. I encountered this object image as a work of art, although I am conscious that the formalized concept of art is not universal. It was my first experience, one that is meaningful in itself and posits this singular artifact against the background of all the other artifacts that I am used to consider as artworks, whatever their dates and original context. This doesn't prevent me or us from inquiring about the meanings it could have had when it was created and the way it could have been used, according to archaeologists. Quite the contrary. Once I considered it an artwork, I was stimulated to understand better how it functions in its original context and how its creator or creators came to be considered artists rather than craftsmen through historically grounded processes of appropriation, literal and figurative, violent and peaceful. So, lesson 4. We should trust our impulse to potentially transform anything we see into an artwork, even though it might not have been conceived as such. This is, of course, a hotly debated topic, especially in the context of the repatriation of artifacts that were stolen or looted in a colonial situation. But in no way should it hinder the possibility of thinking and building a common world based on equality. One of the most exposed arguments is that these objects should be returned to their original context, where they were seen or experienced not as artworks, but as ritual or utilitarian objects. Artification might be a trap for global art history because it necessarily obeys a tendency to homogenize diverse experiences of object images. But it is not specific to non-Western artifacts. In a way, the vast majority of artifacts that have been the subjects and objects of art history, even when they were created in the context where the notion of art was or is relevant, were not conceived as such, as proven by the vast majority of paintings, sculptures, and objects which had a liturgical function, or by images devised to be disseminated through reproduction. It might be a matter of belief, but I, for one, I'm convinced that there is something to be gained in considering, even if anachronistically, that the will to art, the Kunstwollen of Hegel, has been a common feature of all human beings since the first Homo sapiens sapiens, at least, if only because of our neuronal apparatus, as shown by John Onions in his convincing demonstration of how the role of mirror neurons and neurochemical rewards might explain the specificity of the images produced 350 centuries ago in the Chauvet cave. I differ from Onions, though, in that I think that we need to take into account the diversity of formulation of this will to art, including when it is present under various guises and allied to other preoccupations. We just need, as Sally Price emphasized in Primitive Art in Civilized Places, studying the arts made by the Bushinenge of Suriname and French Guiana, and the way Western commentators have wrongly insisted on giving them religious or symbolic meanings, to, I quote her, take seriously the aesthetic conceptual frames which differ from the ones that were slowly built by the Western world. I think that art history, embodied in studies or in museums, is one of the most neutral tools, if that exists, to take into consideration the diversity of functions and effects of an object image in a non-exclusive way. All other tools seem to reinforce what I would call the assignment to a closed identity and not the circulation of meanings that should be our goal in a global world, which does not do away with the aim of the universal, in my opinion, but should qualify, diversify, and de-Europeanize it, transforming it into what Jean Bernabé, Patrick Chamoiseau, and Raphaël Confiant have called diversality. That is, I quote them, the possibility of a diffracted yet recomposed world, the conscious harmonization of preserved diversities. Please note that every word is important here. Lesson 5. My cursory readings have enabled me to understand better the historical context in which this sculpture could have been made, and thus to understand it better and enrich my experience of it. As I'm not an Egyptologist, I won't try here to give an interpretation of this sculpture, about which there's no real monography written. But suffice it to say that I believe, and otherwise I won't waste my time with art history, that we understand object images better when we place them in their historical context, or rather many contexts. In this case, the context of its production, the context of its display, the context of its of the fact that it was lost and buried or found somewhere, the context of its rediscovery, the context of its violent displacement from Egypt to an American museum, etc. It isn't sufficient to understand as much as possible their original context, political, social, religious, etc. We also have to take into account how time and displacements accrued their meanings and sometimes their agency. For instance, if I stay in the context of art history of the ancient Egyptian world, through a rather recent reevaluation of the art of the late period, which was long deemed inferior to the art of the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms, until in 1960, an influential exhibition on the period was organized by the Brooklyn Museum of Art, curated by Bernard Buttman. Lesson 5. Thus, art history makes use of history to better understand its objects. It shapes its own histories, if only because, as Edward Said demonstrated, I quote him, ideas, cultures, and histories cannot seriously be understood or studied without their force, or more precisely, their configurations of power also being studied. The way we look at art and connect it with the past is not only Western. It is a very ancient preoccupation. In ancient Egypt, for instance, there was a preoccupation with assessing and preserving the past, or a certain past at least. I spoke earlier about the way that artists from the 30th dynasty looked back at artifacts from the Said 26th dynasty. But this was a constant preoccupation of the period, as can be seen in the so-called Canopus decree of Ptolemy III, written in 238 BCE. I quote from this decree that is now preserved in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The king marched out and brought back safe to Egypt the sacred images, which had been carried out from the country by the Persians, and he returned them to the temples whence each had originally been taken away. Now to lesson 6. One striking aspect of all comments on our sculpture is that it was made, if the latest dating is accurate, at the time of the so-called final native dynasty. One should feel the implicit nationalism that lies in this simple phrase. Artworks have long been seen as better when they are purer. But in this case, as always, purity is a bad concept. We are dealing with a period in which Egypt was not separated from the rest of the Mediterranean world. It had been under a Persian rule, and its art was connected with what was happening in Greece, for instance, even before the conquest by Alexander. What's more, here the ethnicity of the model is difficult to ascertain, even if I have found no trace that would acknowledge it in essays dealing with the sculpture. His almond-shaped eyes are a typical trait of ancient Egyptian sculpture, but they are also what made Winkelmann write about, I quote Winkelmann, the Chinese form that characterizes the Egyptians. What remains of his nose can be seized as non-white, especially for those of us who concur with the conclusions of Cheikh Anta Diop's Negro Nation and Cultures or Martin Vernal's Black Athena. These observations should not be over-interpreted, though. Even in the 18th century, the blackness of ancient Egyptian art generated opposite conclusions. Winkelmann, who saw Egyptian art mainly through late period examples, wrote, I quote him, "The art of drawing among the Egyptians is to be compared to a tree, which, though well cultivated, has been checked and arrested in its growth by a worm or other casualties, for it remained unchanged, precisely the same, yet without attaining its perfection until the period when Greek kings held sway over them." So in this case, only when white art transformed it. 10 years later, so it's not that much, the French writer Volney wrote, I quote him, "Just think that this race of black men, today our slave and the object of our scorn, is the very race to which we owe our arts, sciences, and even the use of speech." If we take seriously the possibility of an African reading of ancient Egyptian art, placing it in an African rather than European context, as I saw it done, for example, at Yale University Art Gallery, I think it's the only example I've seen which tries to do that completely, and I don't know whether it's still extant. And it's exactly the opposite of what happened at the Metropolitan Museum. It might be fruitful and lead to interesting interpretations, such as the one outlined by Frederick John Lamb. I quote him, "In the known corpus of both Nok and Sokoto works, from Nigeria, current Nigeria, so to speak, there are numerous suggestions of visual affinities with another culture in Africa, which overlapped in time with these Nigerian cultures, that of ancient Egypt. I would like to suggest not that Egyptians and the people of ancient Nigeria necessarily knew each other or had direct contact, but that a pan-Saharan set of conventions may have spread along the trade routes." End of the quote. Hence to lesson 6. Writing a more global art history means doing away with usual assumptions about hierarchies based on nationalistic or ethnocentric biases, redefining our traditional notions, exploring the prospects of a connected art history, which should follow the principle of xenology put forward by Sanjat Subramaniam, but with a strong attention to specific object images, focusing on circulations and relations between them, and not only between artists and institutions. And using the word relation, I obviously think of Edouard Glissant's Poetics of Relation, which should protect us from any retrograde essentialism and puritanism. We all know that nationalism and racism are two of the original sins of art history, which developed as a discipline at the time of the rise of nationalism, colonialism, and slavery. In his book, Les Invasions Barbares, une généalogie de l'histoire de l'art, Barbaric Invasions, a art history genealogy, French art historian Éric Michaud has demonstrated the biological and racist models on which our discipline is based. We are faced with a choice here. We either throw away art history and the very notion of art because we think that they're fundamentally Eurocentric and racist tools. I feel that it is indeed what a lot of contemporary global artists, curators, and art critics are doing. And I can't say much about it. It is their right, I just disagree. I fear, though, that it entails a radical break with the past, which risks turning into a decomplexification of history, of the past, of the present, and thus serving the aims of neo-capitalism, especially as, to quote Paul Wood, I quote, "The period in which the West really achieved global domination is considerably shorter than is often reckoned to be," end of the quote. I think we should better do just what the great Algerian Kabyle writer Kateb Yassine did with the French language that he had learned when his country was a colony. Use art and art history as, I quote Yassine, "the spoils of the War of Independence." We shouldn't downplay the violence of the process. They are spoils. The French word is butin. It is a conflictual situation, and it has to be transformed. Let me remind you that Kateb Yassine stopped writing in French from 1970 to the mid-1980s, favoring dialectal Arab and Amazigh. Here, it is useful to quote Kateb Yassine more at length, applying to art history what he had to say about the French language. I quote, "The few Algerians who acquired knowledge of the French language do not forget easily that they conquered it through a hard-fought battle, despite social and religious barriers that the colonial system built between our two people. You do not use in vain a universal language and culture to humiliate a people and its soul. Sooner or later, this people seizes this language, this culture, and transforms them into long-range weapons for its liberation." Therefore, I am waiting for a global art history that would be written in this spirit, but it can only be written under the direction of non-Western scholars, with, I would say, the participation from and collaboration with Western-trained scholars. And may I say, by non-Western scholars who are not too dependent on the Western academy or museum system. But I do think that they need to be fluent in their languages and methods, because it would just be stupid to waste the knowledge and diversity of approaches accumulated through the centuries. Otherwise, then, this art history, although non-Western, will always be ethnocentric, essentialist in one way or another, whatever the legitimate effort put into decolonizing it, as Pahul-Dave Mukherjee showed, in an Indian context which can be generalized, I think. I quote Mukherjee. "The adherence to ethnicity also signals essentialism in the way it expects that a radically different method of thinking must prevail in India, from which authentic Indian discourse must emerge. Any claim to an Indian interpretative system is as fraught with reductionism as the Western intellectual tradition, as ideas that circulate and cross-fertilize over a long period of time and space do not respect ethnic or geographic boundaries." In order to write this more global art history, it isn't enough to recruit just a few non-Western voices. We shouldn't be satisfied with fragmentary. I'm thinking about those non-Western voices, because when we consider what is the world's most popular artist, we see that cliches still reign pretty highly all around the world. But we shouldn't be satisfied either with fragmentary national or regional narratives, because non-specialists crave for grand narratives. And what they are left with is still Gombrich's Story of Art, conceived in 1950, or Gardner's Art Through the Ages. And otherwise, they are left with media algorithms, which I think is the reason for this map, or the price and wealth wars of the art market, which are fast reshaping periodization and art geographies. I see specific promise in contexts where the colonial oppression has left a complex heritage and any return to a pure past or purification of the future are dangerous lures. So that, to take the example of Algeria again, the present encompasses what in me is Roman, Amazigh, Ottoman, Spanish, or French and Arab, to use the words of Kamel Daoud in his 2010 article, Decolonizing the Body, the Language, and the Sea. Said stated clearly the consequences of this situation in the introduction to his Culture and Imperialism. I quote Said once more, with great pleasure. I have no patience with the position that we should only or mainly be concerned with what is ours, any more than I can condone reaction to such a view that require Arabs to read Arab books, use Arab methods, and the like. As C.L.R. James used to say, Beethoven belongs as much to West Indians as he does to Germans, since his music is now part of the human heritage. End of the quote. I am particularly looking for this to happen in places which have universal or so-called universals museum, and can therefore be fully aware of the fact that, to quote Paul Wood again, I quote, traditions have not in history been equivalent in their relations with each other. And in these museums, you can see a real reshaping of art history or global art history, including Western European art history. This is the case in Mumbai, in the CSMVS museum, where there is a Western art gallery and where the exhibition India and the World could be accessed from many viewpoints, starting from what was familiar to you, depending on your personal history, and going from there to what you knew less or not at all. It is also the case in Algiers, where in the Musée National des Beaux-Arts, you find, for instance, one of the versions of the portrait of Alessandro de' Medici, Il Moro, painted by Pontormo, close to Roman and Greek statues, Ottoman architecture, Islamic arts, Orientalist paintings created by European artists, paintings and miniatures made by Algerian nationals, etc. It can also happen in the colonial power themselves, in the hands of the various diasporas which are present here, working together across national borders. Two recent exhibitions signal for me both the expectations that such endeavors can create and the fact that it is much more interesting when the new narrative that is attempted at is a shared one rather than an exclusive one. A narrative that looks at what happened both in the North and in the global South, rather than one that makes as if what had been created in the South can be dealt with without taking into account how it was shaped by a dialogue with the North. And please allow me to end here with a research project that might constitute one of the most useful tools for this goal, at least for the 20th century or 19th and 20th century. The Global Journals portals devised by the National Institute for Art History in Paris, that gathers more than 1,000 non-European or diasporic critical and cultural journals produced during the 19th and 20th century. I think it points to the right way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric, for that fascinating talk, which serves actually as sort of a perfect provocation for the rest of our festival. I think laying out, as you did, a number of different approaches to how we create this idea of a global art history. I'll give people a little bit of a chance to pose some questions if they like. But I have some, and again, there are so many interesting aspects in the various, as you call them, lessons in this talk. But I wanted to just to ask about one of them in particular, and that's sort of the interplay between your second lesson of the sort of aesthetic encounter, you know, where you talk about Bourdieu and you know, people's own background. And influencing how you know, how maybe even the confidence you might have in approaching a work of art and the aesthetic pleasure you get from it. with your lesson 5, which is saying, where you're saying it's essential to understand better the object you're encountering, through history and through art history. And I guess I wanted to get your thoughts on the interplay between those two things. Does having art history impact the aesthetic experience, or is that something that is separate? And also, I guess, acknowledging that it could be therefore misguided if you don't have art history. What do you think about the interplay of those two things?
I don't think that it's, I mean, misguided wouldn't be the right phrase for me. I do think that you should trust your initial impulse. Just in general, I mean, it might be a general principle for life, for a good life, I think. Trust, and then know that it is based on prejudice and specific situations. So if you want to go beyond this initial impulse, then you can enrich it and sometimes correct it with more knowledge. And I don't know. I mean, I think that it's very true that, of course, the vaster the knowledge, the more confident you can be in trusting yourself in a way. But that's not the precondition. And I was hesitating in taking this example of my artist friends to counter Bourdieu's idea that we all come to art with those notions that are already grounded in us by education and social habitus, because they are what they are. And both Jamil Tata and Adel Abdessemet told me when I was speaking with them, and they're not the only ones. I'm taking them as examples also because I know them very well. When I was speaking about this idea that there's no such thing as an aesthetic experience that is not premised on some kind of pre-obtained prejudices coming from society about what is art and everything, they both said it's not true. We had nothing in our environment that would prepare us for that, nothing that would tell us that it would be something to become an artist. And second, of course, I must say it was especially the case for Jamil Tata, who was living in France at the time. He was born in France. That, of course, when he said at a very young age, I want to be an artist, his family said, that's not serious. And the school said, it's not for you. You're an immigrant, first generation, really impossible. And second, you don't study well in school. I mean, he doesn't have any degree from school and everything. And still he was able to attend art school at a time when it was possible for people to attend art school without having diplomas. Now we want things to be much more open, but in fact, we are closing them in, I think, a much harder way. So to come back to your question, I really think that it's a matter of going back and forth between those things, just as it is in life. I don't know. I mean, I think that some people think that you love less a person if you know them better. I don't think it's the case. And I do think that knowing better changes the way you establish your relationship with the person. That's another thing. But it's and I know that some people might find my approach to art a bit literal in that sense, but it's what makes me be an art historian, I think.
Yeah, I know. That's always personally fascinated me about that whether there's this distinction and how much one needs art history for that more pure aesthetic encounter. You'll sometimes see art historians. I mean, of course, we do want to advocate for the value of art history, but you'll see curators and art historians who, maybe less so than in the past, will say, we don't need labels. Let's just put, we don't want to direct or influence people's experiences with works of art, just put them up. That's an extreme example, but still you have them that want less interpretation, because I think that people will just be able to encounter these works and have a more genuine experience, perhaps, without the intervention of art history.
I mean, I sort of witness quite the opposite in a way, that the idea that works of art speak for themselves is less dominant now than it was in the early 20th century. And I do see an inflation of explanations in museums and exhibitions. And what's most striking, with an emphasis on non-art historical discourse. And I think that's really problematic. The idea that the rest of scientific knowledge is more interesting and more relevant is, I think, a big mistake, and a big sign of art historians' own devaluation or something like that. That I think is a complete mistake. We should fight for what's interesting in art history.
Certainly, I wouldn't disagree. We have a couple of questions, and I'll read one of them to you. This is from Devika Singh, who says, "Thank you so much for this fascinating lecture. You ended with examples from recent exhibitions, the Venice Biennale, Presences Arabes, and a massive research project by Zahia Rahmani, which raises the question of the typically written and often single-authored format of art history. Given their obvious differences, how do you think art history and museums can work together towards this more global approach? And what about the growing defiance towards art history? As you mentioned, they sometimes, with key examples you included, seem to have grown apart."
Thank you for this question, which is quite fast, I must say. So first, about the two exhibitions I took as an example. I do think that what's interesting is the fact that the exhibition I find more convincing is the one that is based on art historical research. The Présence Arabe exhibition in Paris, and the various exhibitions that Morad Montazami has curated in the past, or the publication of his Zaman book, is typically based on long-term research and collective research. Even though he has a singular voice, it's always the case. And what I find interesting is the fact that this research is really shared throughout the world, and it's not something that comes only from some people, either in diaspora or in some countries. And I do think that even though there were some aspects of the exhibition I would be very critical of, there were moments such as the one I showed that really worked, I think, very convincingly, and articulated a more complex art history of the period, which is what I'm looking for. I do think that Pedrosa's biennial, on the contrary, was completely lacking art history, and therefore became incredibly confusing. The room of portraits I have shown puts together portraits that were created everywhere except in the Western world throughout the 20th century or 21st century, without making any distinction and having any look at the specific objects. Each work was there just to be an illustration of a name and of this kind of diversity. And in the end, it didn't teach us much. And it's very interesting. They are the kinds of exhibitions that are extremely popular. But then you ask the people who exhibit them, what did you get from the exhibition? Is there an artist that you discovered? Is there an artwork that you discovered? And most of the time people say, no, I don't remember anything. There were too many things. What I remember is the diversity for itself. And that's where I think there is this mistrust of art history, is the fact that this mistrust of art history is bound with a disinterest for the specificities. And a lot of people prefer broader, so to speak, questions, forgetting their implication in the actual world, or forgetting that there is a long tendency to focus on specific objects or images and that they are the ones who transform us or have the potential to transform us. And you know, I mean, I'm very sincere. When I saw this object in Richmond, I had no idea about what it was, and I just thought it was extremely beautiful, and therefore I read quite extensively on the period and tried to read everything I could find, and spoke with archaeologists and art historians who are specialists of the period. And I think that's the way it should go, in a way, and not the contrary. But I think a lot of people are just it's a case of self-hatred, no, or something like that. That's very common. And I think we should fight against it, basically.
Do you see that more with contemporary art? This sort of self-hatred, as you talk about, when people feel like that it's not as apparently understandable.
Oh,
As
I don't
historical art?
know. That's another thing. That's I think that's also, I mean, that there is this idea behind it that complexity is bad because it's not accessible to everyone. But that's a fact of life. I mean, again, I'm sorry. So it's normal not to understand contemporary art. It would be, I mean, I think it's problematic when you understand contemporary art, because it means either it means that you are yourself a contemporary artist, and that you are you have this kind of way of looking at the world, which is in a way different from your contemporaries in the sense of people who are your age. But if I understood art made by people who are in their 20s, it would be really problematic. It would mean that their art is incredibly conservative, and therefore not interesting, because I still believe that artists can bring something new to the world and enrich it, and that's what I'm looking for every time I'm looking at an artwork.
This is probably, we're running towards the end of this, so possibly slightly unfair to ask another very broad question but I do want to get this out because someone has posed it. And she asks, based on the importance of disseminating knowledge on artworks, the importance of a more inclusive and global art history, what are your thoughts on the process of returning artifacts to their country of origin? Again, a vast sort of question, but I don't know if you can sort of summarize. I suppose it might depend on the situation for
No, I think
various
I would
objects.
summarize it this way. First thing, there's no peaceful history. The whole history of the world has been and is marked by violence and so on. So the question is a different question. It's a question of justice. And it is when we know and when people know that things were looted in a violent way, in a completely unequal situation, and at a time when people thought it was immoral to loot within their own countries, which is the case with a lot of colonial artifacts. I think we should just do what we do in general in terms of justice, which is return the work to their lawful owners. Then it becomes a bit more complicated, because who is their lawful owner is sometimes much more complicated than I'm saying. But I think what would be wrong and bad for the future would be to think that their place is better in their country of origin than where they have been transported. I do think that, I mean, I do believe, if it's not clear, in something which would be an enlarged and more inclusive universalism. And that includes the fact that what I think is the greatest problem is the fact that a lot of people don't have access to important artworks, and therefore don't even have the possibility of saying what is important to them, because they don't see them. I insisted on the materiality of objects because I think that one of the traps of the current situation is the idea that through digital reproductions, everyone can have access to everything. But I know it is untrue. And I know that there is some kind of negotiation to be made between ecological necessities and traveling and all that, and maybe traveling exhibitions, lending, sharing, or I mean, even giving, in the case of some Western countries, would be a good solution. I think the movement is going forward. I think it is necessary to strengthen it and to go more quickly on those aspects. And I think that it has to be truly global. It's not limited to sub-Saharan Africa. It is a truly global question. But there should be a general agreement on when to stop, when to start, and all that. I mean, just as there has been in Western Europe, that after the looting by French armies of the Revolution and First Empire, there was a decision that was made internationally to say, okay, we call for returning a lot of the objects. Then at one time we close the subject and we think that it's done with. And I think that it should be done for the rest of the world.
Thank you. Well said. And thank you for, as you said, your approach is certainly a broad and inclusive one. And I like the idea when you're talking about a circulation of meanings, shared narratives, and citing, Edward Said, and we shouldn't just study art that is ours. So this sort of inclusive approach, I think, is a very refreshing one, and what we need, for a global art history. I do want to mention, just before we go, that there are 2 talks tomorrow from our good colleagues at the French Art History Festival. And I just want to mention those quickly. One is, it's called The Empires on the Board, and it's about 19th century French and American board games. And that's tomorrow at 2:30. And then there's one tomorrow at 4 on the ethnographic photography between science and aesthetics. It's entitled, and that's on the exchange between ethnography, photography, and modern art, and the construction of the new Mexican identities between 1890 and 1940. So 2 fascinating talks from our colleagues at the French Art History Festival. So thank you to them, and thank you so much to Eric de Chassey for this fascinating talk. This will be recorded so that others can view it, and we very much appreciate you joining us. And thank you again, Eric, for this fascinating talk.